Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here sharing our work with you. I'll just need to pull up my slides real quick. As Angela mentioned, I'll be talking about climate-related ecological distress, which probably many of you have heard of under phrases like anxiety, eco-anxiety, or climate anxiety. I tend to opt for the term distress rather than a more clinical Western diagnosis like anxiety, just to acknowledge that this is not, DSM-5 category diagnosis or anything like that, and that there are a range of experiences, and that these experiences and reactions to the environments are normal when we face considerable threats, such as we do with climate change. And so I avoid, generally that use of language referring to disorders. And largely our presentation today really presents on this multi-phase community-based mixed methods evaluation of the mental health effects of climate change in our pursuit to really understand what we can do locally and on larger scales to really ensure that we have healthy communities that can mitigate the adverse consequences and adapt to the adverse consequences of climate change, and not only survive those effects, but thrive in those contexts. And so before I begin, I of course want to acknowledge that I'm joining actually from the territory of the Songhees people here on beautiful Vancouver Island. And I'm just so grateful for the beautiful lands that we've been gifted, and hope that we can all work and support the Indigenous protectors of this land to really exercise sovereignty in a way that will protect it for generations to come beyond ourselves. So to this idea of thinking about climate distress in the context of climate change, I think that there's a number of ways in which we can conceptualize why people might be feeling anxious or upset or distressed in some way, saddened about their lost environment due to climate change. And these, these I think sometimes in some settings get kind of, I can't quite think of the word, but kind of disregarded or set aside as being really inconsequential. You're a worrywart or something like that when you're thinking about something that may not actually come to fruition for decades or longer. But when you actually start to talk to people about how climate distress manifests in their lives, it's really touching upon almost every significant impact. There's a significant impact on almost every significant decisions that you make in your life. Particularly, this is why for young people are an important population to consider, because they're at a pivotal moment in our lives where we're deciding about, what should our career path be? What is going to be the safe, stable community to live in? All of these sort of things. The decision to have children has been one that has been implicated here in this graph. You kind of see, for example, from one of our studies, that as the distribution of climate change anxiety scores really differs for those who have children versus those who are maybe not so sure that they want to have children, or specifically do not plan on having children. And we see that along with other general political orientations, climate change is actually an independent predictor of people's decision to have kids. And so it is factoring into where we choose to live, what we choose to do with our lives, who we choose to live those lives with. And so I think it's a really important, reason to really understand how this will impact people. So we've got a couple little engagement questions just to allow for some feedback. And so the first kind of question that I thought would be interesting to just see what folks have to say is, what social effects of climate change concerns you most? I've just brainstormed a couple of them here. This is certainly not all inclusive, but if you could select which ones concern you most, we'll kind of have an idea. I think you have about 40 seconds left. We'll give you about a minute to do this. So I think, I don't know if everyone sees the poll or when those results will pop up. Okay. Angela, or somebody, can we just, can everybody see? Can somebody give some sort of indication whether they can see the poll results?
Yes, they can
Okay.
see results now.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that strikes me here, I mean, they're all kind of pretty big range. I think food and water security, climate-induced natural disasters are pretty high. Of course, we've seen those things, right? We've seen entire villages here in British Columbia burned to the ground due to things that can be attributed to climate change. You know, we're seeing these things in our already lives over the past few years, and so those are pretty high. But overall, you can see that you know, it's so interesting how varied varied the selections are here, and I think that really reflects the complexity of how people are thinking about this and how different values and considerations might underlie some of the aspects here. But more broadly, or thinking, it also represents that what is climate distress is really this multifactorial thing. It's a complex issue. It's not just simply something that we can measure with one scale and say that every person's experiences of it is the same, but rather people's experiences do quite differ a lot. And I think that's kind of reflected here in this question. So we wanted to kind of understand that sort of variability and what are people's experiences. And so we designed this study using community-based participatory research approaches. The Mental Health and Climate Change Alliance is kind of this mix of academic partners and community partners that kind of have come together since late 2020 to really start to understand what we can do to address this issue provincially. And then eventually we started, engaging people from across Canada. But in this study, we started with, a needs assessment survey to really just understand, the epidemiology of climate distress. We called this the BC Climate Distress Monitoring Survey, and I'll show you some results from that today. Then we went into kind of some longitudinal focus groups with folks to identify features of distress and resilience, so how they were experiencing it, and really try to develop out definitions for what we're talking about when we're talking about distress and resilience. And then, moved into member checking, kind of assess consensus around these measures. Could we get support for the definitions that we developed? And, did these match kind of a people's general understanding? And then also a validation survey to really start to explore those relationships. And we've actually conducted a couple surveys after this, but just given our time, I'm focusing really on this kind of key piece to just take home some key lessons that I think are really important for people to consider when thinking about climate change and mental health. And so I think one of the first things that we were interested in is who is impacted by climate distress. And so I'll explain some of these graphs, but one of the reasons that we were curious about this is sometimes we get this criticism, both from reviewers in the academic setting, but also in the popular press. There's been a number of articles describing climate anxiety or other similar conditions as concerns of privilege, something that white people who have nothing else to worry about might be worried about. And so we kind of thought, well, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to what we're hearing from community. And so one of the things we looked at is kind of the distribution of these climate change anxiety scale scores, which is a measure developed by Susan Clayton here in Canada, actually, that really measures the cognitive and functional impairments that people experience due to their distress about climate change. So worrying so much about climate change that you're not able to enjoy healthy relationships or do the things that you want to do or think about or control your thoughts in a way that brings you happiness and ability to live a full life. And so looking at these scale scores, the thing that really sticks out is you see across groups, many of these distributions are somewhat similar, but in almost every case of these various kind of demographic indicators of privilege, we actually see that the climate change anxiety scores are lowest for some of the categories that we might generally think of as experiencing some level of privilege in our society. And so, for example, if you look across these, men, white people, those with advanced education and training, those with incomes over $100,000 per year, those who are older, age 65 plus, for example, and those who are more conservative or moderate. Those are the groups for who the scores really seem to be clustered against the far end of the climate change anxiety scale. And so that means there's a lot fewer people in kind of this long tail that we see, for these sort of distributions. And so it does say that maybe privilege protects us a little bit from the worries and concerns. I, for example, during the heat wave, being a researcher in this area, something I always acknowledge when giving interviews, for example, about the heat dome that we experienced in 2021, is that I was, inside of an air-conditioned condominium, and had every creature comfort available to me, whereas some of the people who suffered most either were unhoused, so they didn't have these safe, comfortable environments to live in, or they, were in places that weren't adequately equipped. And so I think that really reflects that this is to some extent, a functional response to people's experiences. And so we can naturally kind of disregard this narrative that it's, just simply, a byproduct of privilege of this climate distress thing. That it's not just privilege, that it is really people responding to the environment. So those who are more vulnerable in society, both socially and ecologically, really seem to be more vulnerable to climate change related distress. And so we also wanted to look at, well, are these natural events worsening climate distress? Can one event actually have a population effect in raising really the concern and awareness? And this is really important because the smart climate change people who model out and predict the weather-related events that will increase due to climate change really have a dire message that, over time it will be increasing in frequency and prevalence. That means from climate disaster to climate disaster, we'll have less time to recover. We'll be more likely to be exposed to a higher number of those events across our lives. And so we really, thought it was important to maybe understand what are the effects of these individual or culminating events. And here we actually had a study going kind of before the heat dome in 2021 hit. And then you remember past the heat dome, there was actually an atmospheric river as well. And so we actually collected data that's not reflected in this slide, but we also collected data following the atmospheric river to really kind of understand those compounding consequences. And so kind of comparing wave one pre-heat dome to wave two post-heat dome is what we sought to do. So our next little quiz question is, if you were to guess what % increase in climate anxiety we saw due to the heat dome, I'm curious. I'm just curious what people would kind of guess. I like these little guessing things. There's this study design called Wisdom of the Crowds, and I find that sometimes people's wisdom, en masse at a population level has a pretty good reflection. Okay, so it looks like I'd say probably the mode there is somewhere around 25 to 30%. Well, that's actually, we have a pretty non-skeptical group here, so maybe not representative of the general population. I think the 25 to 30%, well, I'm kind of sad to say, well, I don't know, I guess I'm happy to say. Anyhow, I don't know if this disappoints anybody's expectations for what the increase, but we saw a 13% increase in the average scores, when we controlled for other, demographic factors. Maybe some of this is to do with that fact that we control for demographic factors. But if you look at the distribution of scores, the people who had almost no concern for climate anxiety really disappeared post heat wave. So it does seem to be waking people up out of that complacency as they see that. And so that's kind of maybe an important finding. And now as we see more and more of these increases, this climate distress monitoring to understand how it's slowly eroding away at our mental health is really something worth looking into. And so this is what I was mentioning with respect to looking across these 3 waves of data collection, because as I mentioned, we recruited also after the atmospheric river, is we see that there is an important trend that not everybody's affected the same way. Just as we saw in those density plots that more privileged people were more likely to be in the low end of the climate change anxiety scale scores, we kind of see that different groups have different reactions to these accelerating impacts. And particularly we found that in just these kind of small wave collections, that decreasing climate anxiety over time for people age 65 and for those with high incomes. And so it really seems to be that for really the converse is true as well here, is that those with low incomes or those who are younger really saw increasing anxiety. And so I think it's important to recognize that it's not just about the population level prevalence or issues here, but we also need to think about equity and how individual groups, regardless of what's happening at a population level, individual groups might be hurt more than others. And identifying and working with those communities is, of course, a really big priority. So then we started, as I mentioned, to move into this question of, well, what is the experience of climate-related distress? And then I'll present on resilience as well. But we asked people about what climate-related distress meant to them, and what is this impact? And you can see that there's a range of emotions. I'm not sure how well everyone can see this, but I have another slide kind of summarizing the things that everyone kind of put. But we just had a little canvas board where people could put up a bunch of sticky notes, and these were the exemplary, some of the exemplary quotes. But it's really what we found is within this kind of concept of distress, there's really three kind of key issues that participants identified. They talked about the cognitive and affective difficulties, and so they're worried, they're concerned, they're stressed or anxious, they're sad, or they're grieving the loss of their environments. They feel powerless, disempowered, loss of control, don't have an ability to influence and act for good. They have guilt and shame, frustration, anger, hopelessness, cynicism, apathy, numbness. All of these things are emotions that we want for our society. And given how important the climate change is for youth, I think it really should take seriously the effective impact that our environment has, and make sure that people can deal with that. And so the next category of things, so 87% of people acknowledge that was a core feature of distress, by the way. These orange bubbles here show from our post-validation survey how many people agreed with that conceptualization as it was developed in the focus groups. So the second portion, about 3/4 of people agreed with, was this cognitive and functional impairments. So inability to focus or to feel motivated, ruminating, so really dwelling on and not being able to move your mind away from climate change, avoiding tasks, getting poor sleep, not being able to eat, not doing school or work, which if you think about it, this is going to have impact on many young people's academic performance, which has cascading consequences throughout their whole entire life, including lower incomes, putting more people at risk for food insecurity, all these sorts of other things that could be a problem, really reinforcing and reifying neoliberally driven inequalities. And so that's really concerning to me. Less life satisfaction in general. And then 80% talked about the social conflict. And I think this is really interesting, that conflicts or disagreements about climate change is being really important, and also feeling isolated from the rest of the world, not feeling like you're part of a broader community as being kind of a core feature of distress. And so, what can we do to protect people from climate-related ecological distress? And so we also asked people about resilience. So we did kind of the same storyboard type approach where people shared stories and put sticky notes up and described their experiences of resilience. So with our kind of core concepts here, we had pretty high support for each of these. I think one important thing to recognize that we've really learned about resilience is distress seems to be this thing that we can measure cognitively, that we can get really good. Maybe not all of you are familiar, but with like factor analysis is a statistical approach that we use to see like how cohesive of a thing is psychologically. And distress seems to really be operating on kind of that individual level as it's conceptualized by our participants. But resilience is really not just at the individual level, but people also talked about this community or society level resilience as being really important. And that those things aren't necessarily something a person has as resilience, but it's something that communities and structures and systems can have and build. But just to summarize the different types of personal resilience, people talked about hope and optimism, realism and accurate perceptions. Do you understand in what ways you are likely to be impacted or your community is likely to be impacted? Personal capacity, can you manage that distress? Can you meet your basic needs? And do you have the motivation and capacity to act to follow through with the threats. Coping strategies, mentioned there were 4 kind of broad themes. One was around agency and empowerment, the other compassion and acceptance, seeking out social support, and then climate action, actually engaging to make a difference. And I think that probably has a connection actually to the agency empowerment piece, as I'll show in a future slide. And then community or societal resilience, as I mentioned, it's kind of this multi-level thing. But is there actually access to the resources and supports that you need? Do you have people to turn to? Do you have professionals to help you develop those coping strategies? Do you have literature to understand the impacts of climate change? And are there strategies? Are there things? So if your community is risked to floods or mudslides, are they taking places to actually mitigate those risks? Because if your experiences of climate distress are being derived from your experiences in your lived environment, then it becomes really important that those societal level steps are being taken to build mental health for you. And so we wanted to understand, okay, from all these different types of measures, if we could really develop out a sense of, how are those things related? And so we again went back to, in kind of a multi-successive community-based participatory approach, went back to our focus group participants, and ask them to identify a number of statements. So things like, I feel prepared for climate-related changes. I feel supported in my efforts to address climate change. I feel empowered to make changes, strengthen communities. I'm able to take care of myself. And so we had them develop a list of these statements for both, distress experiences and also for resilience experiences. And so, from that, we were able to then understand a bit about the scope of people's thoughts and subsequently measure that. And so thinking about all these different ways of responses, just to understand that relationship between climate change, we have this little question about what do you think are the best ways to manage climate-related distress? And so again, I've just put a number of, a few little, ideas. Certainly there are many more options and different people need different things, but these are the ones that I think kind of stuck out to us in some of the interviews. I should have maybe moved this slide earlier and put it back with the climate distress piece, because I think the next slide will go back to what we were talking about. But nevertheless, we'll let everyone participate and have a good sense of where people are feeling. And of course, probably people have a hard time choosing because so many, I think this is multiple choice, and so many of these are like not this or that, but a combination. We need to be doing multiple things likely to, I think we generally find in psychological health issues that that multi-component interventions are always better than single component interventions. But just judging from a little bit about what we're seeing here is that so some of the high ones is policy changes in government, right? If you actually address climate change, isn't that the best solution here? I think that's maybe a key piece. Promoting sustainable behaviors, giving people that sense of empowerment to control and act on what they can in their environment. That's certainly something that we are interested in. Other things like building strong, resilient social networks. I think that's something I'm really keen to see, because social connection tends to be one of the most important, factors to buffer people against stress and environmental or ecological components of health. So making sure you have a strong social environment is really critical. If we notice about the things that we don't think, again, thinking about individual lifestyle changes. So individual lifestyle and coping and psychological counseling, those don't win a lot of support. And I think that really reflects like what we found about resilience, is that resilience just isn't about an individual, but is about a whole entire system and structure and community. And so really thinking past those traditional kind of neoliberal approaches and thinking about collective action. And so I thought that was really great. In our data, we were able to take all of these statements that people identified and really start to understand, okay, what is it that what of these statements kind of come out as being quite important? And we've kind of developed, these kind of 6 subclusters. So you'll remember some of them from the previous slides. Actually, all of them would have been parts of the previous slides that showed definitions for distress and resilience. But negative affect, that was that affective component. The cognitive and functional impairment component were really big. There was this component of apathy and numbness. One of social and community support, one on that climate behavior action, let's do something, and then one about a more hope-filled. And so those were kind of opposites in a way, that there was a kind of a hope cluster and more of an apathy numbness cluster. I know this is a super confusing graph, so I'll kind of just walk you through a few of the relationships between these 6 key scales, because I know it's sort of a mess. So first, we kind of see that negative affect is associated with both action. So you can see that the strong green line is kind of the effect size on that action, but also apathy and numbness. And so there really seems to be 2 paths that people take from those negative affective impairments. We also see that negative affect is also correlated with impairments, but that's here you can see it's also correlated with the cognitive and functional impairments, and that those cognitive and functional impairments are inversely associated with hope. And so from that, you kind of get the sense that, okay, negative affect can impair you. It means that you're less hopeful. It means that you, but it also means you're more likely to engage in action. And so I thought that was, kind of an interesting finding. And in general, one of the things that we've really struggled with as we try to define climate-related ecological resilience and distress is we actually see that some of the things that we think of as distress really drive the resilient action. So we see, for example, something that we call like the good steward effect, in which people who are distressed about climate change, take actions to improve it. We see that it actually levels out a bit, and I should have included a slide here on that. But if you actually look at people who have very high levels of distress, the positive relationship between distress and climate action kind of disappears, because people eventually experience what we like to call, or is emerging to be called, climate paralysis, which is that type of distress that you don't want. So we need to move people back to an effective form of worry and concern that makes them do positive things for their environment. Okay, so I just want to get back to this graph, but the cognitive impairment is higher when climate hope and social supports are lower. And impaired people are also more likely to have that apathy and numbness piece. However, impaired people are also more likely to kind of be engaged in climate action. So there's a couple kind of key things that I pull out from that is one, again, this like driving force that distressed people are engaging in these sort of resilience type things, but nevertheless experiencing distress. That there is this tension between climate hope and apathy and numbness, and that making those kind of choices of moving people towards hope and action really seems to be a good way to maybe offset some of the negative effects. Again, kind of drawing out this picture of that there's 2 paths you can go. And then also, I think just this association between impairment and climate action really speaks to the need to provide supports that are supporting those people who are doing the things to protect our environment. So climate activists and those communities really need the kind of extra support to ensure that what they're doing for the rest of us are beneficial. 2 other findings that I just want to cover from this, or just thoughts that I think are interesting about these findings, is low hope and climate action are kind of correlated with the apathy and numbness. So again, kind of speaking to that kind of dyadic tension between those 2 things. And then also social support's role. It appears that social support primarily benefits through promoting climate hope and action, with a positive association between those 2 factors, particularly with action. That, and I think maybe some of this finding is that those who are able to engage in climate action have either they already had the support of their communities, or they found community by seeking out that climate action and hope. And we also see that the more support you have, the lower cognitive and functional impairment you have. So it really speaks to maybe to address some of the impairment related issues, kind of building social support can be another key piece. And so again, I think at least what we kind of come out with evidence for at the end of this little study is that really promoting hope, promoting action, and promoting cohesion and connection seem to be kind of three key strategies that we were able to kind of identify. And so this pro-environmental behavior and social support, I think I said I should have had a slide on it, but actually now I remember I do have a slide on it. And so you can kind of see that this considered steward effect and eco-paralysis effect, it's, as people become aware of climate change and become somewhat more worried about it, there certainly is a steep improvements in engagements for behavioral engagement, but that effect really levels off rather quickly. So I think that our message should be, I think sometimes an activist would say people should be worried about climate change, and certainly that's true, because if we're worried, that means we're going to reach a crisis point, and crisis points are opportunities to make decisions about how we're going to live together in this world. But when we don't follow through, we don't make those decisions, and that distress continues to increase and to increase and to increase, we see that really the effectiveness really seems to level off. So most of the benefits are gained earlier. So I think our goal in public health and in other settings should be to move people from a state of maybe that more severe distress and more to a state of awareness and concern and worry. And I think part of the challenge of doing that is to learn to communicate clearly and effectively in a mental health aware way of discussing these risks. And then finally, with this social connection and climate distress, we conducted another study, and these results have now been published as well. That kind of that higher subjective sense of disconnection, the higher the climate anxiety. And in fact, we know that from our analyses, almost all of this is explained from a buffering effect on generalized distress. So, having a community may not change the basic concerns that you have about the climate change, but it does buffer, the harmful effects of generalized psychological distress, at least as measured by the K6 here. And so we're looking at a number of interventions and approaches to really try to bring together these opportunities of leveraging community to engage and build, to empower young people in particular to act within their spheres of influence to really address the climate crisis. And so just a quick summary of key points, and then happy to talk about conversations. I know we're a few minutes running behind, but climate change related ecological distress are complex, right? They're multi-factor. There's a lot going on when we're talking about these things. The impact of climate change and mental health are inequitably distributed. It's not a concern of privilege, as is often portrayed in the media. Though I do acknowledge that oftentimes the voices that we hear are disproportionately privileged people, because within any movement, there does seem to be a tendency of privileged voices rising up and dominating the discourse. And so I think that is maybe a phenomena that should be looked into more. Third, kind of to protect people from distress, we need to build resilience by strengthening social supports, facilitating climate action, and promoting hope. That's kind of what I showed you in that messy diagram. And then if people become too distressed, they become less effective climate stewards, and that social support is a good buffer for the distress that people experience. And so with that, I think I'll turn it back to Angela or Chris or whoever wants to take over from there.